So talk to me for a moment about why a revenue benefit that's outside of the forecast that the company did for themselves, why that may be considered persistent, under what conditions it might be persistent, and under what conditions it might not be persistent. Okay, so let me give you a couple scenarios, and you tell me if you think they're persistent or not. So my company buys Alex's company, and Alex's company has a mad R&D group. I mean, they're innovative consistently, and I bought them in part for that R&D group. You're coming out with new products, new services, innovations, and you have a culture of that. That my company's been okay, but it doesn't have the dynamic that your company has, okay? In that case, if I now merge these two companies and believe that we're going to support this R&D group as we move into the future, should that give us a best owner premium that is persistent or continues over time, or would it give us a best owner premium that might continue for a while but then fizzes? What do you think? Brigham?
I think continue and fizz.
You think, say again?
Continue, and then it will just not fizz out, but it will just kind of, it won't be such a best owner premium after some time because it will start being the norm.
Okay, so you kind of you're taking a hybrid. And I would argue that if we continue to support that R&D group the way that it has been, which is the whole reason we bought your company, to be honest with you, Alex. I mean, we like you, but let's face it, you're a little gimpy today, so we're not going to be dependent upon you. But we bought it for that, we're going to support it for that. I think that that's one that we could argue would be persistent. Because if we have brought into the existing company that only had an 8.6% sales forecast, right? If we brought into it a dynamic of introducing new products, new services, expanding markets, and we support that, it should do so certainly through the rest of our exclusive period. I would argue.
But, like, to argue with Brigham, like, it wouldn't be a best owner premium anymore, it would just be a growth rate. Like, wouldn't the best owner premium slowly just translate into...
Yes, which is why in some of the material you simply see this best owner premium referred to as an adjustment. So, and I don't have it right in front of me, but we had a sales forecast that ended at 8.6%. And there was some market something, and there might have been a leadership something, and there might have been a quality something. I don't remember exactly all the details, but it added up to 8.6%. I've applied down somewhere else on the spreadsheet this adjustment for best owner. And by the way, the term best owner premium, again, it simply means adjustment, but it's a term that comes out of McKinsey's playbook, because in their case, there are adjustments that are a function of the firm or the asset being placed in the hands of a better owner, one that is prepared to make more of it. And then there are adjustments that might be scale economies or other economic adjustments, etc. Okay? So we could either apply that premium here of 2%, in which case we're at 10.6, and then seek to apply that on every year of the revenue forecast in the explicit period. But if we do that, we're making the bold assumption that this 2% is persistent, okay? And if it was, then that would be okay. But if it's not, then we create another problem for ourselves. That's why I've separated out into two places. So if I would argue that this innovation, R&D, the dynamic engine that we brought into this thing is persistent, give me an example of something that might not be persistent. Please.
Buying a warehouse that has like a better machine that would produce more units on the first year, but then after that it wouldn't continue to produce more and more units. It would just be like better than ours.
So you're talking about a supply side issue, and I think you're connecting if we can make it, then we can sell it. I got to think about that for a minute. I don't know that that's inaccurate, but I haven't thought of it from that perspective. My immediate response was to think about that as a cost efficiency. But let me think about that while we're talking.
No,
it's a new marketing campaign. After you're acquiring the company, maybe you're an owner who has a history of being a really good marketer, and so you'll see sales increase for the first year, and maybe even the second year after that, it's just become.
Okay, so this combined entity now has a new marketing dynamic and life to it that's been breathed in that it didn't have before when it was simply the acquiring entity. Okay? In your scenario, are we going to continue to support a significant marketing effort, or are we only going to invest in it for the next couple of years?
Just a couple of years.
In which case, I agree, there would not be persistency. We would expect that marketing campaign for, let's say, 2 years, perhaps, or whatever year it's going to be. We would expect that to give us a benefit, but once we quit supporting the campaign, then it'll quit giving us that benefit. Hopefully, we'll retain that which it already gave us, but we can't expect it to continue to give us more after we quit investing in it. I would agree with that. What else? So Cole, your company has a really interesting product mix and customer group. And my company has a similarly interesting product mix and customer group, but they're different products. We aren't competitors. We may have some of the same customers, but you're on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast. So there's a pretty good chance that we don't have a big overlap in our customer group, unless we're already both well entrenched nationally. Okay? And the products that you sell and your services are complementary to the ones that I sell. So it's reasonable to believe that if Mikkel is your customer, then he probably has need for my products and services, probably isn't buying them from me, is buying them from someone else. And if Zach is your customer, then he's probably buying mine, or he's probably not buying mine, he's buying them from someone else. Okay? So our two companies have this transaction, I buy yours. And our customer groups now become one. And your customers have access to my products, and my customers have access to your products. Is that kind of a one-time benefit? Or is that benefit going to, let's say it gave us 2%. No, let's say it gave us 4%. Are we going to get that same 4% year after year after year after year? What do you think, Kara?
No, because that customer base has already been introduced to the new product.
Yeah, so it probably isn't going to happen immediately, right? On day one, it didn't expand by 4%. But maybe we projected that in year one it would expand by 4%. And after 3 years, maybe that benefit had been fully integrated. So I would say that's not persistent. And I think most people would agree that kind of thing wouldn't be persistent. And it phases out. It doesn't go 4%, 4%, 4%, nothing. It probably goes 4%, 3%, 2%, nothing. And beyond that point, it doesn't start taking away. It just no longer continues to add to. So in the problem set that you have, I've suggested there's a 2% best owner premium in sales that is not persistent. I don't know that I've given you a lot of reasons why. I've just suggested it's not persistent. And in the first year, this is in the footnotes, in the first year you would see all 2%. In the second year, you would see half of that 2%. Again, these are both added to your basic sales forecast, so the 8.6%. But by the end of the third year, so 2 years is gone, it's no longer there because it was a one-time event. So we're suggesting that within the space of 2 calendar or fiscal years, that benefit has been integrated into the company. Now, it led us to a higher level of sales, right? Higher level of revenue, on top of which our 8.6 then compounds for any additional years in our explicit period. But you've got to think about persistence versus non-persistence when it comes to sales benefits. And you determine that based upon the story you're being told, the plans that are being laid, and the synergies that cause these companies to either merge or one to buy the other or whatever the strategic relationship became amongst them. Does that make sense? Let's now turn the table and think about the same kind of thing with respect to expenses. So again, Cole's company and mine, we become one, and the company is now bigger. We have a scale economy that we did not have, which we believe gives us a benefit, or gives us a benefit, a best owner premium, perhaps an adjustment for our expenses. Is that an increase in our expenses, or is it a decrease in our expenses? Decrease, because from my perception, if my expenses go up, I don't see how that's a benefit, right? That's a cost. So a best owner premium in sales, a benefit in sales is an increase in sales. A premium or a benefit in expenses is a reduction. So instead of being 1 plus some number, it's 1 minus some number, right? Okay. So if this has launched us into a higher sphere scale-wise, and we continue to grow at some level beyond that, which should continue to launch us in further, do we expect the expense benefit to be persistent or not? Wait, I'm sorry?
Persistent.
Persistent. So we have a difference. So Sherry, why not persistent? And then I'd like to know why persistent.
Well, I think based on what you did for revenue, your cost of goods sold should be along that your revenue growth, right? So if you have no longer 2% of best owner premium, your expense should be the same direction.
Okay, so I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of how that argues for non-persistency. I think what you're saying is, well, if it launched you into this new scale that has a better pricing, then you don't continue to launch further still. Right?
So once you have the best owner premium, it puts you into that new scale economy where you have lower average costs. And even though the growth from the best owner premium night was out, you still have the original growth, and that will continue along the new scale economy curve.
Yeah, so you're saying that it's launched us into this new sphere where prices are less, but our growth beyond that continues to do the same thing. Oh, it might marginally diminish, but you're arguing that it's not going to go away. And I would suggest that most corporate experiences are that it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away. If we believe that we're going to get a 1% reduction or in expense, then we're probably going to continue to get the 1% reduction. In fact, in a future week, I'm going to show you how to model an exponential movement of that, which truly takes us into increasing returns to scale. We're still kind of in constant returns, right? But we changed from the scale return in the base year to a higher one. You've noticed that because you've been projecting this, to a higher one in the second year, but then after the second year, it's not changing anymore, is it? And you can see that in ROIC. If your ROIC goes from one number to a better number, but then stays there, we really haven't gone to increasing returns. We just had a one-time increase, right? But I would argue that by and large, most expense adjustments or benefits are persistent, in part because here we are, and Mikkel, who's the operations manager for this deal, and he's responsible to negotiate the expense contracts with most of our input suppliers. And we know we got a 1% improvement in our prices last year because we grew the scale, the amount of work we were doing with this company. As you go to the table to negotiate the next year's prices with them, are you going to ask for a 1% again?
Of course.
Yeah. Now, if you weren't growing, if you couldn't give them something in exchange, like higher orders, bigger volume each year, you might not feel like you could argue that, negotiate that. But if you're coming to the table and saying, hey, look, last year we expanded our business with you by 8.6% in this case. We expect to do it again next year. And you were able to give us a 1% price adjustment when we had that expansion, and we would like another 1% price adjustment as we give you another 8.6%. Now, you may not get it, right? But I think it's perfectly reasonable, even expected, to argue it or request it, and you never get what you don't ask for, right? Or rarely will it just be offered up to you on a silver plate. But it's hard for the supplier to say no to that because it's a marginal issue for them. They're getting more business. They're going to have more revenue from you. And they're doing the exact same thing. They're going to their raw material inputs, etc., and always seeking lower prices. At a point, is it possible that your firm is large enough and that you're doing enough business with any given supplier or all your suppliers that getting continued price reductions isn't realistic? Yeah. If you're buying 100 million units of whatever it is from me, and you expand that to 110 million units, yeah, it's a 10% increase. I mean, that's not nothing, right? But you already were at marginal cost when we got there. And there is nothing more for me to give you without me starting to lose money. Is it prudent for you to push your suppliers for lower prices so aggressively that they continue to give them to you to the point where they start to lose money on you? Why not, Kira? I mean, you get lower prices. Why do you care if they're losing money?
Because if they go out of business, you're out of the supply.
Well, that might be an issue. That could be an issue. Yeah, I think it's bad.
I argue it depends on what you're producing though. I mean, if you're selling pens and you have 3,000 pen manufacturers in the US, burning out one supplier shouldn't matter to you.
Unless we have every reason to believe that all the pen suppliers in the US have the same basic input cost structure, which if they're providing the same product, they probably have a fairly similar cost structure. And if she's, let's say Kira's already at marginal cost, and if she goes further, then she's in a loss situation, which will kill you after some period of time, right? You might then go to another, let's say it's Sherry's company, who's willing to supply you, and you come and say, Sherry, here's our existing contract. If you'll meet it with this requirement, then we'll move our business to you. She might say yes, but you put her in the same position, and fairly quickly you will pick them all off, and you got a different problem, right? I guess part of this is an ideological item. Having been on both sides of this discussion and table, I will tell you that personally, I think you always leave a little bit of profit on the table for your suppliers. Because if you don't, and any bobble takes place, you are not their first priority. You want for them to always have a little motivating factor to serve you well. I can't remember the guy's name. You would recognize him, How many of you are fans of MASH, the old TV series? How many of you have ever even seen MASH, the old TV series? Okay, I feel a tiny bit better now. There was one of the two lead characters in the early years his name was Trapper John. And it was an actor by the name of Wayne Rogers, that was his name. And he was only on it for the first couple of years. And in fact, I think he was in the movie as well, if I remember correctly. And he came across as this kind of bumbling, womanizing, hard-drinking guy, with a sense of humor. Fact of the matter is, he had an MBA from Princeton, and the guy was a killer businessman. And years after this experience that he had on TV, he was still doing a little bit of acting. He was making most of his money in business. And he bought the Circle K group of convenience stores. Do any of you know Circle K convenience stores? I mean, there are thousands of them. This is about a $2.5 billion transaction. And I had a role, a very small role in this transaction. And he made the comment, as we were talking about a number of things, and it stuck with me because it was early in my career. And he commented that he never wanted to pay a bill on time, but never wanted to be the customer that paid the bill the last. I'm paraphrasing. He wanted to always pay them, but he never wanted to pay them too early because cash flow issues, right? And he never wanted to make a supplier bleed but it didn't bother him to make one cry. But he thought about that. We actually had a conversation. He didn't want them to have to bleed money. He wanted them to have to just be as razor sharp as they could without bleeding. He wanted to leave at least something on the table. Well, you know, that stuck with me because here's a guy early in my career, which means decades ago, and he's got a multi-billion-dollar transaction going. This guy wasn't nothing, right? He knew more than a little bit. He'd made some money and acted and then put it to use where my guess is if he's even alive anymore, he's probably a billionaire at this point. He was closing in on it then. Anyway, for what it's worth. But I think that premiums or adjustments in most expense categories are persistent. But premiums and adjustments in revenue categories, you have to think about persistence or not, based upon what's really going on. Okay? So, if we're finding the revenue this way, I'm going to call it BOP. If that's how they found the revenue for year one, the revenue for year two, I've said is going to equal the rev for one times 1 plus the forecast ratio for sales plus, in this case, half the BOP. And in the revenue in year three, it's going to equal the revenue in year two times 1 plus the forecast ratio for sales plus anything? No, plus nothing then, because at the end of the 2 years, I've said that the best owner premium in revenue has dissipated. It is no longer persistent. So now we're back to this, right? Please.
How would I calculate this? Let's say if we started with a best owner premium of like 2% and we wanted to get it to decrease 1% rather than dividing it by 2, like how would we calculate?
So a couple of different ways. And I saw Sherry, I was working with Sherry earlier this morning, and she put up a field, a cell that represented the periodic decrease in that premium. And in which case, you would have said 1 plus the forecast ratio for sales plus the best owner premium in the first year, 1 plus the forecast ratio of sales plus the best owner premium minus that 1% reduction each year. And you would let that continue on until it fulfilled your expectation. So you do have to do some changing as you go from one forecast of revenues, expenses to another company's forecast of revenues, expenses to another. You got to think about how you have to adjust your formulas to reflect that scenario. But I think the easiest way is to go ahead and either have it dissipate at even rates and you just do dividing, or dissipate at a given rate and have a cell that references that given rate. Or you might even have a little matrix of 4 or 5 different years, and the first year it declines by this much, and the second year by this much, and so when you're using your formula, it goes out to that matrix and pulls that change in. Either one of those would do just fine.
A 1% decrease would be like best owner premium minus 0.01, right?
Well, it could, yes. So if it was 1%, now are you talking about a proportional 1% or a nominal 1%? So if it's a proportional 1%, you're saying, okay, we have a 2% boost, but every year, proportionally, 1% of that's going to go away.
Oh.
In which case,
Yeah,
versus every year, nominal. Okay. And either way, just think about how you model these things by creating cells in your spreadsheet that represents the change, and then when you do the equation, collect from that cell. So if you would then say, well, maybe it's not really 1%, maybe it's 0.5%. In which case, you don't have to go back into each equation like you might have to if you're doing these divisors. You can just go in and say, change the 1% to 0.5%. Please, Greer.
On the final year 6, the CV year, on
Yes.
I remember you helped me do something different on that like a couple weeks ago, but with this situation, it's not the same equation, right? Because
Well, it is. It becomes this equation, right? But now, and let's assume that year 5 is the last year of our explicit period.
yeah,
Okay?
so it's 393.
So the rev for year 6 is equal to the rev for year 5 times 1 plus some forecast ratio for revenue for that year. But if this is the year that is beyond the explicit period,
just long-term G.
what is the forecast ratio for sales for that point in time?
Mm.
Is it our 8.6 or is it some other number?
Is it the long-term G?
It's the long-term G. So just be mindful of what number you're expanding this by. Yes?
And then another question. So I get it. I have it laid out correctly now, but the one thing I was kind of confused on is on the, for example, year 2, you divide it by 2. You're just dividing that by 2 because it's 2%. It was
Yeah.
So like if it was like 3%, you would like that 2 isn't just set. It's just to make it 1%.
None of it's set in stone.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm talking about there being a 2-year persistency and it having been a 2% benefit and saying that after the first year it cuts in half. So I just coded it to reflect that.
Okay.
You've got to understand these formulas here well enough to be able to manipulate them. It's hard to perfectly model these without understanding what's going on inside of them.
And then that 2, that's dividing by the best owner premium, but also the forecasting ratio, right? The 8.6 that we originally have.
Dividing by...
So I don't know if I'm saying, so do you know, so in this cell I have like, if you look at your revenue 2 line right now, it says it's divided by 2. That's picking up that whole equation, the 1.
No, it's not. It's just picking up this, because that's a plus.
Oh, okay, duh.
Okay?
Yeah.
So it would be 1 plus 0.086
Okay, perfect.
plus 0.02 divided by 2, which
Got
makes
it.
this 0.01.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, be careful of order of operations.
That's, I was just
And
making
in
sure.
Excel, order of operations becomes a little harder, for me at least, than it does on paper, because it's all about getting the parentheses in the right place. And if you only have 1 or 2 sets of them, that's no big deal. But you'll get to a point in some of your modeling that you'll have 10 parenthetic statements, and they've got to be embedded properly, otherwise your outcomes are just not great.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is for revenue, but in our constant returns to scale environment in which we have said that there is a constant debt to invested capital ratio and there's a constant revenue to invested capital ratio, or vice versa. So it doesn't matter to us which is the numerator, which is the denominator, but there's a ratio that we can use. In that scenario, what else do you have to affect by this kind of change? Yeah, net working capital and fixed assets. Because they are the components of invested capital. So you would do the same thing, just exchange out for Rev 1, 2, 3, and 4, exchange out net working capital. At 1 equals net working capital of 0 times 1 plus then this forecast ratio for sales plus the best owner premium. Net working capital for year 2 equals net working capital for year 1. Just exchange out in those cells, because what you need is for your net working capital and fixed assets to move at the same rate of growth as your sales, in order, if you're maintaining a constant returns to scale, and if invested capital is going to continue to be the sum of the two of those. In which case, you don't need to change invested capital by some ratio. You simply calculate net working capital plus fixed assets. That's invested capital on the operations approach. If you suggest that your assets, invested capital, are growing at the same rate of sales and recognizing constant returns, what else are you saying about how this company makes money?
They make money based on their asset.
They make money based on their assets. You're going to find, if you look at this carefully within research projects or whatever you might happen to do someday, that companies tend to make money two ways, either on their assets or on their equity. Okay? So a bank, a financial services firm, a financial holding company, an insurance company makes money off of equity, and most other companies make money off of assets. And in fact, if you looked at the 108 firms in the Dow 30 and S&P 100 combined, and there's some overlap there, so there's 108 firms. If you looked at those firms, 7 of them make money off of equity, and the other 101 make money off of assets. If we do this, then we're, as I've suggested with fixed assets and net working capital, then we're arguing that the assets they're making money off of is their net working capital and their fixed assets. What assets are we completely leaving off the table when we make that argument? Are those the only assets that we would commonly think exist in the firm?
Intangible assets?
Intangible assets might be a thing, might be a big thing. Okay? Do companies make money off of intangible assets?
Sometimes they sell their patents, like.
Well,
Not
increasingly, companies make money off of intangible assets. If we were having this conversation 40 years ago, we're just at the very dawn of what we think of as intellectual property and within the internet era, et cetera, right? And so, yeah, there was intellectual property, but it was always capitalized, it was always patented. But today, do we patent all of the intellectual breakthroughs? No, in fact, some of us are staunch about allowing those things to be public or open access, right? Share them with others so they can expand the economy yet further still. And some are still keeping them very tight, okay? There's a problem within the banking industry at this point that's really kind of interesting. And I spoke to a group of bankers not too long ago, in fact from the biggest banks in the country, and their models that they were using to get the appropriate values for companies in the market that they were lending to and such were providing the wrong outcomes, and they were using the right models. But when they used the wrong model, they would get the right outcome. And so there were some scratching heads. And saying it's a wrong model doesn't really mean wrong. It means a model that didn't conform with what the textbooks and the published articles would suggest. And it's because intellectual capital, non-tangible capital, has become pervasive, such that now we have companies that have virtually no fixed assets, or very little, and they don't offer a service. They produce a product, but the product is a digital product. And it takes no assets or even necessarily equity to produce it. It only took assets or equity to develop it. But once it's developed, it produces at marginal cost of near zero, right? But they can be extraordinarily valuable assets. Ask Google, Microsoft, Uber, and any of the high-tech up-and-comers. They don't make money off of equity. They don't make money off of tangible assets. They make money off of intellectual assets, right? And intangibles. So I was explaining to this group of bankers, they needed to change some of the models to embrace intangible assets. And if you're not going to capitalize intangible assets, and often we don't, right? We expense them. So if Alex's company is out there and creates the Shazam whiz-bang new app of the century, you probably didn't capitalize that, the expense of creating that. You expensed it out as an operating expense in the years in which you experienced that. But, and because you expensed it out, it doesn't show up on the balance sheet, right? But it is that which is giving you the millions that you're taking home this year. So there's kind of a disconnect we have to start to think about, which means for some of these companies, we have to think about new multiples or new terminal value constructions or new discount rates that maybe we wouldn't have considered before. Okay.
So are those codes that they use to do all the programming, those are considered intangible?
Yeah. So you've got these three guys to your right, and they're your high-tech Shazam whiz-bang developer, programmer, Scrum Master, etc. And they put together these millions of lines of code, and you now own it. But it's, I mean, where is it? I can't go look at it. I mean, unless you print it out, right? It's this big, and even if you did, the printout doesn't do anything. So it's intangible. It's intangible. And that's become increasingly important. We always recognized how to handle intangible assets in terms of goodwill, because you would capitalize that. But this is one that increasingly is not capitalized. So it never shows up in fixed assets. Never shows up, certainly in net working capital, but it doesn't show up in fixed assets. So we have to think about how to deal with that. There's another asset category that, as intellectual capital has become more valuable, that has similarly become more valuable and doesn't exist on the balance sheet. What is it? Okay, Francesca, you're the basic business person. You repeat a lot of the things you've been told over years and years because they're truisms for a reason. And one of those is, my company's most valuable asset is?
Humans.
Your employees. Employees. Yeah, I mean, you hear that all the time, right? Like, a lot of business people will say, my most valuable assets are my employees, and yet my most frustrating assets are my employees, right? So it is the veritable double-edged sword. Do your employees ever show up on the balance sheet?
No.
Not so much anymore, okay? 100 years, a couple hundred years ago, maybe in this country and others, but not so much anymore. Does the effect of your employees show up on the balance sheet?
Yes.
If you capitalize it, but if you don't, if you expense it, then it doesn't. Well, the effect is intangible, right? It may be extraordinarily profitable. So Mason is the rain man that works for our company. I don't mean the numbers rain man. He's the guy that people flock to our company to work with. He's the consultant, he's the head VP, Shazam whiz-bang guru of sales, or whatever it happens to be, right? If that's the case, Mason, am I probably paying you a lot of money?
I would think so.
Well, otherwise you're going somewhere else, because I promised Mickle would pay you more if I'm not treating you well. And you'd rather work for him for an extra couple $100 grand a year, right? Because Mickle's going to recognize your value if I don't. You don't show up on the balance sheet. Even if I have a contract of employment with you, you don't show up on the balance sheet. But you're reflected in my revenue, and my expenses are what they are, but you're also reflected then in my retained earnings, and that migrates to the balance sheet, but not as a fixed asset, maybe as net working capital, unless we buy something with that. So you got to think about how this migrates. I mean, we've always had the reality of any service business being largely a function of human capital, right? I go to my doctor. I'm there not because of a particular machine. I'm there because of that physician's education and expertise. And my doctor, she's probably been in practice for, well, she's almost my age. I try to have someone that's a little bit younger than I am, so that A, I know they have some experience and maybe can even understand the things that are germane to the age of my point in life. But also, I want them to be a little bit younger so that I think I'm going to die before they do, okay? Rather than after. If they're older, then they're probably going to die first, and I got to find a new doctor when I'm like really old, right? And I don't want to have to do that, right? Human capital is intangible. It's intellectual. It's not on the balance sheet because we never capitalize payroll. It's always expense. So there's a new dynamic at play that is morphing valuation multiples, which I don't think we've talked about much at all yet, but we will. We've talked a little bit about, nothing with multiples yet, right? I didn't think so. But we will after your break. Okay, so does that all make sense? I mean, I know that goes further than the assignment you're looking at, but only marginally. What other questions might you have about the Excel assignment you got in play right now? Please, Bruce.
For COGS and S&A expense, I don't know if you said this earlier, but will that's a negative effect on it? The
Yeah, so
premium?
a premium, an adjustment that we would think gives us a benefit
Yeah.
in an expense category is a reduction.
Okay. So with the equation, would it be as simple as making the plus sign a negative sign?
Yeah,
or-
that's exactly right.
Okay.
But, well, yes, but not in this framework. We talked this through at some length a few days ago, and maybe even twice, I don't know, maybe not. But it's worth dealing with briefly again now.
Sorry.
So let's say we identified a forecast ratio for a particular expense category, and it equaled 0.86. By the way, if we did that, what information did we use to identify that forecast ratio?
That expense over revenue.
Yeah, for the base year, we observed the expense in that category, divided it by the revenue for the firm, and that was then our forecast ratio. What if the base year was an anomalous year? We, for whatever reason, had an extraordinarily high or extraordinarily low expense compared to prior years. How would you then not simply reflect that anomaly long term?
Would it be right to just take like a 5-year average? and
Yeah,
use those?
so if we got this by taking the expense of year 0 divided by the rev of year 0, but we thought one or both of these were anomalous, you could take expense that's average of years 1 through, I'll call it X, divided by the rev that's an average of years 1 through X, and get an average expense forecast ratio that you believe is more indicative of your normal experience. So don't be married to or tied to just using 1 year's worth of observation. Because if that observation is anomalous, for whatever reason, then, and you use only that one, you're moving the anomaly through your future, and that's probably not a good idea. Anomalies, by definition, aren't reliable, repeatable, consistent. So you don't want to do that. In this class, we don't do any of these averages, but it's important to me that you recognize that you have the ability to. Okay? So, let's say we have that that 0.86. And then let's say we've identified revenue for year 1 is 1,000, which means the expense for year 1 would be equal to 860 without any other adjustments, right? If we want to make an adjustment, then let's say we have an adjustment, and we can call it a best owner premium, or it might be something else. If it's a best owner premium, that adjustment is a function of something the new owner of this asset brings to the table. But we may have adjustments that aren't a function of that. We may have adjustments that are just scale economies, because as the company grows, we might pick up some scale economy, right? So I think it's generalized as an adjustment. You've got it shown as a best owner premium because of the story that underlies it in this particular case. Are we now going to take this and say we take the revenue from year 1 times the forecast ratio for that expense minus the adjustment, or, and this is going to give us the expense for year 1, by the way, or to get the expense for year 1, do we take the revenue for year 1 times the forecast ratio times 1 minus the adjustment? Which is the accurate way to do it?
The second one?
The second one. Why?
Proportionally decreasing.
Yeah, so a little bit of this is dependent upon what we meant by a 1% or a 2% adjustment, right? Is it nominal or is it proportional? And in the convention of how we're constructing these, the way we're talking about them, then we're saying that this is proportional. And you'll see me even use this term in problem sets, or use the term proportional in problem sets versus nominal, and especially on any examination you might experience. Okay? So it shouldn't be left up to the imagination, hopefully. Okay? So in this case, taking the revenue of 1,000 times 0.86 minus 0.01, or 0.85, would get us 850. We did that. In the second case, and I apologize, I didn't bring my calculator. Somebody grab a calculator, please. And take 860 times 0.99. Tell me what that becomes.
851.4.
0.4?
Yep.
Okay. And you're going to say, well, it's a 1.4 difference in this case, which is not a big difference, right, Nicole?
I'd say it's a big difference.
Well, it is if it's in millions or billions, right? And to some of us it is if it's in single dollar units, because if I don't have that in my pocket, it's a big deal. Is money everything?
Yeah.
Who said that? Okay,
I'm joking.
I don't think you are.
Well, my logic whenever people ask this question is it's not it's not everything, but it gives you the opportunity to have everything. What you so like for example, people say like, can money buy you happiness? I think it can, because I think if your happiness is skiing, for example.
We just shouldn't go here.
No, this is okay. We can't go here.
I'm trying to
No.
I'm trying to
But I'll bring
validate.
this to a point I think will make sense for you, and we can go here.
Do you know what I'm saying though? Like I get like yeah, if you have bad health and you can't afford it, then obviously you're not gonna be happy, or like if someone died you can't, you know. But my logic is if your favorite hobby is skiing and you can't afford a pass or you can't afford something, then that your lack of money is preventing you from your happiness. So it leads to your happiness if that's what you validate. But
So
obviously
let me
that's
change the paradigm only slightly, and tell me if you think that this has greater truth to it and less controversy. Okay? So, have any of you ever been, and you don't have to answer the question, just think about it. Have you ever been in a position where you couldn't pay a bill that had to be paid, you couldn't afford to buy something that had to be bought, and that you were in a, life was not good, not being able to meet that expense? Some of you have, some of you haven't. You will be at some point. I don't know anyone that reaches well into adulthood that hasn't had the experience, okay? I certainly can remember way too many times where you didn't have the money. And when you don't have enough of it, money is everything. It occupies your every waking thought. If you've got a mortgage payment and you don't know how to make it, it occupies your every waking thought. If you have a child that you don't know how to provide something for that is necessary, then I promise you it occupies your waking and non-waking, woken, there's a word there that I don't know how to articulate, thought, right? So until you have enough of it, money seems like it's everything. Does it expressly buy you happiness? Well, no. In fact, it can buy you misery and sorrow if it's used improperly. But when used properly, it makes happiness a lot easier to attain because it alleviates the stresses and pressures that sometimes keep us from being happy with what we already have, right? So that's not terribly controversial, is it? I'm okay saying those things?
Yeah.
what I was trying to say.
Did you notice he shook his head as he said, yep?
Well, I'm not the mediator.
No, it's okay. But you're the guy that said, oh, we don't want to go there. So you put yourself in that position.
All right.
Yeah, I promise. Till you got enough of it, money's way too important. Hopefully, once you've got enough of it, it loses its importance. If it doesn't, that's where the problem is. I was interviewed by Merrill Lynch in Portland, Oregon, when I was trying to get my first job out of college. And the guy asked me a question that probably would be thought of as not allowable, maybe even illegal at the time, given today's sensitivity to how we do interviews and such. And the guy noticed that I had served a mission for my church some years prior to this experience, and supposed that to mean that I was a very religious person, and said, well, how do you respond to, this Merrill Lynch was all about making money, right? So how do you respond to, or how do you deal with the Bible saying money is the root of all evil? I think if someone asked that in an employment interview today and made a decision upon it, I think you'd have a lawsuit that would be very easily won. Okay? But at the time, you didn't think that way. And fortunately, I looked at it, his name was Henry Alwinger. I can remember it just because the situation was poignant. And I fortunately had the presence of mind to say, well, Mr. Allwinger, the Bible doesn't say money is the root of all evil. It says that the love of money is the root of all evil. So I don't think it's an issue. I was shocked that I had the presence of mind to say that. I think he was pretty surprised because he didn't think that's what it had said. I don't know why I went there for you, but it was an interesting story. So you got to make sure you use the right numbers. Otherwise, we've overstated the effect of the benefit. 850 is less than 851, and it's an overstatement because this is a reductive element, right? It takes revenue and reduces it by a dollar amount. If we reduce it by less dollars rather than more, then it changes the outcome. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
This is kind of like a daily use question. When people like investment banking or whoever's doing modeling, are they truly like what we're doing for this class of like we were just adjusting our model based on the numbers? Is that all they're doing for their job in a sense? Is they get a company, they have the models already pretty much laid out and they're adjusting to that?
Yeah, I would say that is a tremendous amount of it. But it might be they're not changing the model, they're changing the value of the inputs they put into the model. Okay? So I might have a model that says, and here's where we put cost of goods sold expenses. And if the model isn't structured in such a way as to take adjustments into account, I might adjust the value before I put it into the model. Okay. Now, that's all an issue of being able to interpret when you make adjustments and when you don't. Just like some of this is how you model an adjustment and how you don't. So we are starting to venture into the interpretation and artistry within finance. Okay, so let's move on to talk about project investment selection. How many of you have started that problem set? Oh, good. Okay, so we can have a decent conversation. So Francesca, can you kind of talk us through the relevant elements of Don Treader Enterprise? And then, Zach, did you raise your hand? Were you one of those that started?
I think that's what.
Curate, were you? Would you then consider talking us through the relevant elements of You Can't Get Enough? And who else? Ryan, if you'll finish us off with Bible and boutiques.
So in their model, they have 3 years of negative cash flow of 5 million, and then it gets to 3.5 million, and then it grows at a stated rate.
Okay, now I'm going to stop you a few times so we can think,
Yeah.
how does that kind of show up in our models? Okay, so we have 3 years of negative cash flow of $5 million. Then we have 1 year at 3.5.
Yes.
And from there, for 3 or 4 years, it moves at 35%. And then what happens after that?
Then it gets to 8%.
And is 8% then long-term?
Yes.
Okay. Tell me about the rate of growth in our explicit period. And how long is the explicit period? Hopefully you're not looking at the solution set.
It's 5 years, because it's, well, our explicit period, I guess, would be 8, because it takes the first 3 years to negative cash flows.
Okay, so in modeling this, since we're not doing a year-by-year forecast of revenues and expenses, how would you model an explicit period that has 2 different rates of growth? Because during part of this explicit period, the rate of growth is 0, right? Negative 5 million, negative 5 million, negative 5 million, the change is 0%, and nominal. And then beyond that, there's a change. How would you model it?
Would you take the 2 and add them together?
I wouldn't. You primarily seen me model where we have a rate of growth during an explicit period. Here we have an explicit period that can be bifurcated, split in 2, and each of its periods have a constant rate of growth. The first is, I think, 3 years at 0%, and the next, I think, is 5 years from a starting point, 4 more years, at 35%. So I would, instead of having one cell that represents the explicit period's growth, I would have two cells, one for years 1 through 3, and the next for years 4 through 8. There's no reason you can't do that, right? You can then just pick up the appropriate reference in the appropriate years. Okay? Okay, and then as we go beyond the explicit period, we're at 8%. What do we think of a business that we know it's going to lose money in the first 3 years? Are we okay with that? Why, Brigham? Yeah, losing money, you might as well just spit at it.
Yeah, I don't know. If you can see the potential future cash flows, I guess, that would be like the textbook answer. I feel like you're okay losing money if you know in the long run that it's an investment in the company and the future cash flows.
Okay, I'll agree with that. So, I know of companies that in their first year turn a profit. It's not common necessarily, but it's not uncommon, okay? But a year, which is the accounting period of time that we've been talking about in this class, is that the only period of time that you might adjudicate for a firm? No. Would you adjudicate quarters, calendar quarters? Okay? And you might have lost money in your first calendar quarter, in your second calendar quarter. Yes? I'm sorry. Assessed, analyzed, looked at the merits of. Thanks. And then by the end of the first year, maybe you were at break even or profit, but there were some quarters in there that were lost, right? I think that's very common for a new business. And if we're bringing it down to months, it's even more common for there to be some lost months. And if you break it down to weeks, it's even more common. And days, it's even more common. Now, for most valuations, you're not going to consider days or weeks. You're probably not even going to consider months. But you might think about what adjustments need to be made to your models if your forecasts, revenue, expense, etc., was a quarterly forecast. Then you have to think about, well, if I'm looking at depreciation, it's going to be a quarter's worth of depreciation. If I'm looking at fixed assets and net working capital, well, that's a balance sheet item, it's a snapshot item. Those don't change, but I take the snapshot as of the end of that quarter, not the end of the year. And I'm measuring changes from one quarter to the next, right? My revenues, my expenses are for that quarter, or for that month, or for that week, or for that day. So I don't think there's anything unexpected about a business losing money in its earliest periods. Admittedly, a small business and $5 million a year, that may be a tough pill to swallow, unless you've got enough of a future expectation to overcome. So be willing to think about that. What do we think about then going from negative $5 million to $3.5 million, boom? That's a $8.5 million shift in 1 year. Mason, does that sound realistic?
Personally, no.
Personally, no. Agreed. What might have to be in place in order for you to believe it?
Not sure.
Okay. If I simply said, well, I just think the market is such that by the time we finish losing 15 million of your dollars, Mr. Investor, then we're going to make a bunch of money for you. Does that sound like a credible response? Not so much. Was that a hammer? Yeah, I think you had one before you said. Yeah.
Let's just say the government contract.
Oh, wow. Music to my ears. A, contract. B, government.
This would be a
Right.
government.
Yeah, which means by theory of transitivity, a government, right? Okay. Is there any reason for a government to not be able to make good on its contracts?
Bad news if they could.
Really bad news. We call that default. Okay. And the government that prints its own money has no reason to ever default, right? So that is like money in the bank. Money in the bank. And absent that, I would find this forecast very non-credible. Okay? So if you're going to have a big move, especially going from terribly negative to meaningfully positive, you better have a credible backup for it. Otherwise, it's not going to be believed, and if it can't be believed, or it can't be believed easily, then you must increase the discount rate substantially to offset the risk, right? Okay, so we go from negative to positive and then a 35% growth rate, but we got a contract. So apparently this is a multi-year government contract that assures some revenues over a period of years. Talk to me for a minute about going from 35%, Francesca, down to 8. So 35, 35, 35, 8. Does that seem realistic? Zach?
I mean, that could be when your government contract is over and you no longer have this client that you're expecting these cash flows from, and then you're looking at kind of your growth rate based on the clients you're assuming you'll have.
So you're the CEO, and I'm the chairman of the board, representing the rest of us shareholders. How much are we paying you? Give me a number. It can be any number. Since we're making believe it.
2 million.
2 million, okay? So Zach, you have salespeople, managers, vice presidents, et cetera, et cetera?
Yep.
Yeah. Are you telling me that over the next 8 years, you and this highly paid management team of yours can't come up with some new business beyond the government contract that you have? Is 8 years not long enough for you to find some new conduits for selling our products and services? You don't have to answer it, because the answer is kind of obvious, right? So even though in this case I didn't have you model another period, you might think about how realistic it is. And you might, rather than go from your high rate of growth for that many years, which let's face it, we're way out in the future on this already, aren't we? Because I think this takes us to year 8, and we've argued largely that's a little bit further than you might go comfortably, okay? But if you got a contract behind you that's good as gold, then I think you might be able to do that. But is it possible to say, okay, realistically, we think we can either find more business during that 8 years where we have some guaranteed business, such that by the time that 8 years is done, we don't have to all of a sudden boom to 8%. Either can do that, and then you can gradually move off of the 35. Maybe in year 9, you go to 20. In year 10, you go to 15. And then in year 11, you go to 8 maybe. Or before the end of the explicit period, you might start to model that decline, which is more common, by the way. Now, again, if there's a contract underlying this, maybe you don't need to do that. So you guys know that we have a bunch of students right now that are competing in a national collegiate evaluation competition. In fact, tonight they do their initial presentations on the case. If you're interested in seeing any of this from them after the break, they'll be doing presentations. I'll be asking people to come and watch and give input and feedback. So those presentations will be preparatory to the presentation they'll make at Georgia State. If we're not doing it after the break, it's because they didn't make it past the next threshold. Okay? Which I don't know. I'm hopeful. Let's put it that way.
2 teams or how many teams?
2 teams. 2 teams. But by the time we come back from break, there will only be 1 team. Because if we have a team selected, it will only be 1 team selected. And then the combined people will use all their collective creativity, resources, et cetera, to support the 1 team that goes to Georgia if we get that. So, and we're looking at some of these cases and seeing that most of the evaluators that have evaluated some of the cases we're looking at have looked at the firm's revenue forecast, and as we get towards the end of the explicit period, they start to reduce the expected revenue changes, because the further we get out of the limb, the less confident we are in the stability of the limb, right? So they're hedging the bet, and they're doing it prudently. That's not an unrealistic strategy. In fact, it's probably a very realistic strategy. But you got to think about one or the other. Now, if we go from 8% to 5%, 8% during this explicit period, 5% in perpetuity beyond that, that probably doesn't require a tapering. But 35 to 8, that's a big change, right? So argue something else. Now, don't do the valuation the way it's introduced to you, but as you're thinking about what you might do otherwise, what your recommendation might be, you might think about changing that. Okay. How about you can't get enough? Who was that? Was that you, Karen?
Yeah, so they develop food product franchises,
Okay.
and they see 10% cash flow for the immediate 10 years. And then industry projected growth rates of 6% beyond that. And then
Okay,
most,
so say that one more time.
so,
What's the first set of years look like?
so the first 10 years it's 10%.
Okay.
And then beyond that it's 6%.
Okay,
And then their most recent cash flow number is 1,800,000.
okay.
Um,
And that's for what year?
I think it's 20.
And then is that the base year?
Yeah.
So year 0. Okay. So if we've got $1.8 million in cash flow in year 0, and we're trying to think about cash flow in year 1, how do we go from year 0 to year 1? Nicole, how do we go from year 0's cash flow to year 1's cash flow?
Year 0 times 1 plus growth.
Thank you. You know, and in fact, some of you are thinking, come on, Rick, we've gone through this 100 times, but I promise you, every time I do this problem set, several students have a problem going from year 0 to year 1. All right, keep going.
Their discount rate is 12%. And they're seeking funding based on a $15 million valuation. Market returns are 7% and their payment is 1.2.
Okay. Is it possible that I've given you a little bit of information in these cases that's unnecessary, superfluous, or a red herring? Because as it turns out, I'm just not a very nice guy, right? If you're given a discount rate, what is the virtue of a beta in some of that last information? Or will you use it? You won't. Some of you would otherwise think, well, I'm going to have to figure out CAPM and everything because you start to get some components for it, but you're given the discount rate and the perspective of the investor to think from. It's a red herring. Okay. 12% discount rate, 10% explicit growth, 6% long-term growth. Do we have any concerns about coming up with negative valuations and positive cash flows? Zach? Not in this case. Why? Because we have R greater than G. When R is greater than G, then algebraically we will come up with a positive number, assuming we have a positive numerator, which is the cash flow, and we do. So we don't have any concerns about that. Okay? Anything about this particular case that makes you a little bit uncomfortable as a would-be investor? Mikkel?
I'd say maybe projecting a 10% growth in year 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, maybe even 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? Yeah, that's a long ways out on the limb, isn't it? To be so bold as to give that kind of a number. Okay? Would we be able to argue? Well, wait. We still think it's got great growth after that, and we moved from 10 down to 6. Yeah, I still think that 10's a long ways out without anything else, anything else that's fundamental or foundational. No contracts, no track record, etc. Right? Anything else about this case? This case brings into focus two different parts of industry that are problematic. Restaurants, which is what we're talking about here, right? We're going to franchise some restaurants, have chain. What percentage of restaurants make money? That make economic profit? I don't know the answer either, but it's really low. Does that mean that all those restaurants are necessarily losing money? No. I said economic profit, which means that the owners, which are probably the chief cooks, bottle washers, cleaner-uppers, everything, and who probably work from about 6 o'clock in the morning until upwards of midnight and to come back at 6 o'clock in the morning. I mean, if you've never observed restaurant-owning families, then that is their life. Especially the little one-off mom and pops that are all over the country, whether it's pizza or Asian food or burgers. I mean, if it's owned by me and my wife and our babies, we are working our freaking guts out, right? And are we getting paid much money? No. Now, we're probably getting paid less than our services would be worth in the open market, which means we're creating an economic profit problem of opportunity cost not equaling what we're experiencing. So that's a problem for me. Some of you, and Mickle might be one of them, because of the grit on your face, have heard me say the fastest way I know to lose money is in food service. Hands down, bar none, fastest way I know to lose money. The second fastest way I know to lose money, as it turns out, is to invest in franchises. What percentage of franchise operators of a new franchise structure tend to make money in the opening years? Pardon? Very few. I don't know the number either, Zach, but I would agree with you, very few. The majority of new franchise opportunities go bust. It's the minority of them that you ever hear about as consumers. And the bankruptcy halls are littered with people that have invested in food service, and invested might mean opened up their own restaurant, right? And franchises. So this has kind of a 1-2 negative punch that I would avoid this like the plague, except for one thing. What is it? You're all familiar with the food pyramid? You're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy? So we have a food pyramid deal going on here. What is at the very top of any legitimate food pyramid?
Fast food, sugar.
McDonald's.
Okay, we have a whole different concept of food pyramid than I do. Wow, that explains so much, Garrett.
What did you say?
I know. You're welcome to interpret. So most people would say at the very top you've got things like vegetables and really healthy kind of stuff.
Oh, alright.
I would tell you that's a lie. Okay? At the very top of the food pyramid is a category that only those of us that are truly enlightened completely understand. And it's barbecue, Dr. Pepper, and if we're really enlightened, we understand that it includes grits and hush puppies and maybe collard greens and such. Okay? This is a barbecue play, right? I'm being a little bit facetious, but only a little bit. Body by barbecue, okay? All right, let's talk about number 3. Is it going to be hard to model this one, by the way? One rate of growth during an explicit period, a little longer than we're comfortable with, but you ought to be able to model it, right? Okay, so let's talk about by-the-way routines.
Wait.
Brian, was that you?
Yes.
Did I hear wait?
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't understand. The firm remains undercapitalized to support franchisee acquisitions for its BSG ribs. What? I don't fully understand that.
Okay, let me take a look, because I want to put in perspective what you're referring to. Oh, that's simply reason why it's looking for funding.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, because if you're being asked to value a firm and invest in it, because this is not simply valuing the asset, this is thinking about an investment, right? Selecting it. If you're thinking about doing that, you want to know why they're looking for the capital or the transaction. And in this case, the firm as it stands doesn't have enough money to get this done. They're looking for deeper pockets.
For new ribs and new franchise lines.
Yeah, right. So they can lose more money. Do you guys know anybody that's ever made money in a restaurant? Yeah. So one of our grads, Pete, I think his first name was Peter. I want to say it was Wang. He graduated about 2 or 3 years ago. His family owns the Asian Star on 13th East at about, well, it's just below Fort Union at about Union Heights. It's a good-looking Chinese place, kind of modern-ish looking, a lot of Asian food. It's got it going on. Any Friday and Saturday night, the place is just packed. His dad is doing really well. He's been in the business for like 35 years. It's a great place. If you ever need a really nice upscale Chinese place or Asian place, it's certainly one you want. The Asian Star, 13th East, but quite a ways south. Okay. By the way, boutiques. Talk to me about it.
So it's a quality women's apparel boutique. They have 8 domestic locations right now, and they're looking at expanding to online and offering discounted prices online.
So the locations now, are they profitable?
Yes,
Okay. And does this firm have a track record of profitability?
yes.
It's not just the last 6 months, right? In fact, I think of the firms that we looked at, it is the only one that has a reasonable track record of profitability. Okay, keep going.
So the base year cash flow is $5 million. It has a discount rate of 18%, and then it has a growth rate of 20%, and that's also in perpetuity.
Okay? If you look at my solution set, I model this out using the growth rate of 10%, or excuse me, 20%, and I model it for 20 years, not just 10. But I get the exact same number that I would have gotten had I modeled it for 10 years instead of 20, or 1 year instead of 30, or 5 years instead of any other number. How come?
Just the growth rate for explosive and continuing periods are the same.
It's the same. When you have the growth rate during your explicit period that's consistent with the growth rate in your continuation term period, do we need to model the explicit period separate from the continuation? We don't, do we? We know that in this case, we're going to be looking at val, or maybe net present value, we'll get to it, which is the sum of the cash flows in years I divided by 1 plus some rate, discount rate to the t. We only add the continuation when this summation isn't an infinite summation, right? So in this case, we don't need a continuation expressly. We can just do this, can't we? What's the problem with doing this? It's infinite. How do I add, how do I sum an infinite series of values? Well, fortunately, we all know an algebraic shortcut. That gives us the same number out to about, I think it's 50th decimal place or something like that. It's out far enough, nobody concerns about it. This would equal this if the growth rate of this cash flow was constant. It's the same thing. So in this case, we don't even need to think about explicit. I've done it here just to show it to you, okay? So that's the thing all by itself. Is there a problem that you immediately recognize for this very profitable firm? Brian, what is it?
It's the WACC is less than the growth rate perpetuity.
So when R is less than G, or WACC is less than growth, what's going to happen to this?
Negative.
It's negative. So this is going to give us a great big negative. In fact, it's going to be a great big negative. Would you pay money for a firm that estimates a negative value?
No.
Would you?
I would for this one.
Really?
Yep.
Tell me why. Because there's a reason you might be willing to do this, by the way. Why would you do it?
Because you still have crazy cash flow. $50 million. And it shouldn't be that hard to turn those 2% around.
Let's assume for a moment that you don't think you can turn around. Let's assume that you believe brick and mortar is dying. Most everyone would say that. I think we have a lot of evidence that would suggest it's not dead, and it probably won't die. It's just morphing and oughtn't to be all the growth of the company or all the presentation of the company, right? So let's assume that the brick and mortar isn't really dying. How are you going to turn it around?
I wouldn't. I would just squeeze it for as long as I could and then liquidate.
Oh, are you a corporate raider? Is your name Carl Icahn or Gordon Gecko? Buy it, take it apart, sell its component parts? In which case, is the valuation now a function of this forecasted cash flow, or is it a function of something else? It would have to be a function of something else, right? You might have to think about, well, what's the brick and mortar worth? What are those leases worth? Does it own the stores? I mean, the physical buildings. What are the component parts worth? And if you could look at all of those, and you don't have enough information to do that in this case, right? But if you could look at all those component parts and say, we're not going to do this thing that's going to cost us all this money, because it's the future stuff. We know the brick and mortar stores are making money. So we're not going to do this other stuff that'll cost us money. We're going to buy this into the portfolio, and we're going to turn around and either just operate the business that exists and not continue to morph on into losses, or we're going to buy it, sell the component parts, and you're going to value it based upon the underlying value of its component parts having eliminated what you think is the problematic piece. And if you can get to a number that's big enough for what the seller is asking for, you might be willing to buy it. If you can't get to a number big enough for that, then you might negotiate with the seller. Or the seller says, look, 90 million, is that what they want in this case? If they say, look, it's $90 million, that's, if we can't get 90, we're not selling, then you might say, great, and knowing you forecast that you can sell the component parts for 100 million, in which case you make 10 mil immediately. Or you would then think about, selling it off or running the existing business and not making a mistake to continue on into this loss lead. So in this case, this one is designed for you to see and think about the utility of these different equational forms and to blatantly see R minus G. The first time I presented this, I had a student that went ahead and ran this forecast out for 100 years. Because it's positive cash flow, right? Growing out 20%. You could forecast out for 100 years, couldn't you? And year 101 was the first year of the continuation period. If you do that, will that not overcome this negative value that builds?
It's still not.
You can't run fast enough, Zach. Just can't do it. Because that continuation term is still going to live somewhere, and it's going to be so horrifically big if you're using 100 years out, right? Because the cash flow by then is extraordinary. 20% growth, we don't see that for 100 years. But the cash flow would be extraordinary. That negative value, you're going to end up with the exact same number as you did if you simply did this. It doesn't make a difference. That's why DeMotoran says if you can't come up with a positive cash flow long term, you got no value. But synonymous with that is this. Is there another potential solution to this? Please.
Well, you were saying how it's an issue with your growth rate, it's shrinking, right? So if G shrinks to a point where it's lower than R, then your valuation will switch anyways, but it's like an issue of capacity, right?
Okay. Okay, that's part of it. You might model that. You might make those assumptions. That's not what you're going to model in the first questions here. You're asked to model what is in front of you. But then you're given some latitude in beyond that, right? So you could suggest that. What else might you suggest? When R is greater than G, or WACC is greater than G, is the way we've talked about it. It simply means that the company's internal asset structure isn't sufficient to support the rate of growth. So you might be willing to acquire this at the 90, knowing that you must bring on additional capital later on. In which case, if you're bringing additional capital into this, what's going to happen to your R? Has to go up, because if you bring additional capital in, you're increasing the risk. You must increase the expected reward. R went up. R maybe is no longer greater than G. Now you've got something positive. So this is perhaps simply an incomplete story. Okay. So have any of you looked at I think it's question 5 maybe, or the last one, in which case they say, okay, now what would you do? Which of these companies would you buy? Or would you offer for, and how would you structure it? Have any of you looked at that yet? What do you think of my response, Carol?
like yours homes?
Yeah, mine.
Um,
Or have you looked at my solution set is what I meant?
yeah. I mean, it makes sense, but I didn't do that.
Okay, cool. I don't necessarily want you to do mine. What'd you do? What'd you suggest?
I did this one because I said that 20% long-term G is just ridiculous.
Okay?
I would use something more realistic, and then probably give them a lower number. Like I wouldn't pay 90.
Okay. And I might go so far as to say not only is using that 20% G long-term a little bit silly, right? But thinking about 20% for the next 10 years might be a little bit silly. If we're talking about retail clothing, I mean, this is not a high-tech growth industry necessarily, but the technology play here is interesting given online, and then the repurposing of existing clothing is also a little bit interesting, right? There's actually a big market in repurposing of high-end clothing, big market. Some of you probably are aware. So I think that's credible. And maybe didn't offer them the 90, is that what you said?
Yeah, I'd go way lower.
Yeah.
I used like a 5% long-term G,
Okay.
and then I wouldn't pay 90. I'd pay somewhere in the 70s.
Okay.
And start getting positive.
So in the last part of this, you're certainly welcome to simply agree with what I've done, but I don't want you to model what I've done. I want you to think about what would you do. Now I chose Dawn Treader because government contract is music to my ears. And if I can project a positive cash flow on the government contract, and I've got 8 years to find more business, music to my ears. Okay? And it's in a green energy space, renewables and such, music to my ears. It may not satisfy my taste buds as you can't get enough, but I'll go down the street to any barbecue place around and satisfy my taste buds. And I can get Diet Dr. Pepper at any gas station in the country, right? So that was my scenario, and I also changed the terms of the deal. If you're evaluating purely from the standpoint of doing a valuation, and the business gives you numbers that they believe, but that you don't, are you within your rights as a professional to come back and say, Sherry, I know you think that you're going to grow at 20% for the rest of time and all eternity, but I have to tell you that we have no examples of any firm ever having done that. I think we need to revisit that idea. Should you do that?
Yeah.
Sure. Otherwise, you're just a monkey in an iPad, right? The whole issue of value in consultancy is interactivity and giving the client information. And if you're the client, as an investor, you do it for yourself, and then it changes what you offer. And sometimes I might be looking for 90 million, but you know what? If nobody else is offering me more than 50, and 50 is a lot less than 90, 50 might be beautiful to me, right? Because $50 million, I don't know about you guys, but $50 million would be nice. Okay?
Is it not common for companies to like inflate their number knowing that they're going to negotiate it down anyway?
Absolutely. But in this case, well, in the case of Dawn Treader, given the numbers they gave you, not Dawn Treader, excuse me, By the Way, in the case of By the Way, given the numbers they've given you, they just don't know how to count, right? And by the way, that's one of the reasons I wouldn't have done business, I wouldn't have been interested in the management of this firm, because they don't know what they're talking about. And if they don't know what they're talking about at this level, they don't know what they're talking about at other levels as well. But if you're buying it, and you own it lock, stock, and barrel, do you have the ability to put in different management? Sure you do. Now, you may be wise not to get rid of the innovator, founder, energy dynamic, but put in a CEO who's more of a professional CEO and capture the value of that dynamic and the innovation, coupled with some good professional management to safeguard your investment and make more out of it. Okay? So you got all kinds of latitude. So I want you to think about that as you do this case. What would you do? Have fun modeling. Do you have any questions about how you will model this? Please.
We've already created a model very
You've
similar.
created a model.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just we'll be using the problem set with the model.
Use the problem set with the model, find NPV, find IRR, find MIRR. I think I asked you for profit index maybe? I don't remember. No, not in this one. You might have to change the number of years of explicit and continuation, right? But this is designed for you to think about that multi-columnar structure that we've talked about, that you've already created an Excel spreadsheet before, and altering it from 3 years to 5 years to 7 years to 10 years, 2 years, whatever is necessary. That's what this assignment's about. Okay? Yes, please.
I just had a question on number 3.
Okay.
And it's, I don't know if we covered it or
Maybe not.
I'm just too tired when I did this.
Ah,
Why is there not an IRR, but there is an MIRR?
yeah, good question. There is not a finite equation, singular equation for internal rate of return. It is an extrapolation. It's using a equational form to see if that comes close to what the number should extrapolate to be, and then based upon the difference, going back and forth and back and forth. Your calculator computer is actually doing some intelligent guessing until it gets a number that fits a set of conditions. Okay? So in this case, it never reaches a return because it's always negative. And IRR estimations in Excel don't understand negative. Okay? So it's a problem all to begin with. But the MIRR equation, and I haven't shared it with you, but it's in the notes online, and you don't need to know the equation, you simply need to know how to find it with Excel. Okay? The MIRR equation is a singular equation. Okay? And in fact, it's the future value of the cash flows divided by the present value of the outlays. What it boils down to. So it's not too bad, and it's actually the nth root of some of that. Okay. So it's there, but since it's a singular equation, it comes up with a response that's plausibly negative. That's why. Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. Let's talk just a little bit about Wednesday and next week. Okay. So Wednesday, as we've said, we're not going to hold class. You guys have some work to do, though, right? And one of the most important elements that is due soon that I want you to work on Wednesday is what? Outlining your paper. Yep. Which I think is due just a couple days after Wednesday, right?
Well, you said there's gonna be a sub coming to class, no?
Not Wednesday.
Okay,
The following Monday and Wednesday. The
okay.
following Monday and Wednesday.
So we don't have to go to class, but.
This coming Wednesday, you don't need to be in class. We won't hold class at all. You're certainly welcome to show up here. You're welcome to all show up here. But you'll just be you. And no, I'm serious, work on things together, right? I know some of you already do some of that. Use the time. Collaborate. I think it's a good idea. Okay? Because you're not going to be here, I'm going to ask you to electronically submit the problem set. You've had a choice before now. You can submit it electronically or physically. No one's going to be here to receive it, so submit it electronically. You have the MS Word document that is the problem set linked in the assignment in Canvas. Open up that MS Word problem and copy and paste your spreadsheet responses and structures into the appropriate place. Save it and upload that MS Word document to the problem. And you'll have met the requirement. Okay? But then the following Monday and Wednesday, you're going to be working on a couple of things. And I believe it's Colton Williams that will be working with you. How many of you know Colton? Smart guy, getting ready to graduate, knows this material very well at this point, has been involved in each one of the courses that I've taught on this, and is a mentor, not one of the participating students, but a mentor for the Valuation Challenge, in part because Colton worked for one of the higher quality valuation consultancies in the region for about a year, and so I didn't feel it was fair to have him be a professional at this, have him be part of the competitive team. And he's here for a few months. He did an internship over the summer with a large regional bank in Southern California, where he's been given an opportunity to stay long term, and he'll go back there as soon as he graduates in December. So Colt knows his stuff, so respect it. He's going to walk you through the next Excel assignment. He's going to walk you through the problem set that you'll work on through the break, or just do after the break, okay? And if there's time, he's going to walk you through the LBO model that I discussed with you last week and told you I would deliver for you. And I finished it. It is on my website. So if you go to the richardhaskell.net, look at the Excel templates, you have the links to those, you're going to see leveraged buyout model. That is the model form of what we discussed in class last week. And if there's time, he's going to walk you through that. If there's not, we'll probably revisit that towards the end of the term. Fair enough? Okay. Don't skip out on Colton. Valuable to have access to him. Okay?
For the outline, it requires some models that haven't covered yet. For those bullet points, can we kind of just do it?
Yeah, you may not have a lot of detail in those. Yeah. Sure. And by the way, if you give an outline that says, okay, I'm going to do this model, because I have to, and then I'm going to choose this model out of my discretionary choice, and then if you end up deciding you want to choose a different one, you're not going to be penalized for that or held accountable. This is designed to make sure that you are critically thinking about this now rather than waiting until the last week of the semester, in which case you're going to be critically thinking about it and unhappy at the same time. Okay? All right, I think we're clear.